This is R2D Tech, and having looked at some of the new MacBook Pros in the Apple Store, I thought I'd give you some of my first impressions comparing both the 14-inch and 16-inch models along with some of their specs and different configurations, so stay tuned. The first difference that's easily noticeable is the outer design, which is quite a bit different. Apart from having a slightly different shape around the corners and a different finish as well, the laptop also appears to be slightly raised off the surface that it's on. That's actually to improve the ventilation of the laptop so the airflow can actually escape from underneath, and that should improve performance slightly by stopping the laptop from overheating. I'll get onto the actual performance slightly later, but I'll just say right off the bat that these laptops are absolute beasts, and chances are you won't need the fans at all for most of the tasks that you're doing, or at least if they're light to moderate tasks. When you actually open the laptop, there's quite an apparent design change. First of all, the bezels are a lot thinner, which is very nice. The display looks a lot nicer like this as well. But one thing that really stands out, at least when you first see it, is quite a large notch. This design choice is slightly questionable, I think, but in the end you are getting slightly more screen real estate, so it's probably worth it. It does confuse me slightly why they needed such a large notch. It's pretty deep, resembling that of some of the older Pixel phones. Not that attractive, especially since the only thing that's in this notch is a 1080p FaceTime camera. Yes, you heard me right, 1080p, which of course is a huge upgrade if you're an Apple fan, since we've only had 720p cameras in the past. But if you're a Windows user, then this is pretty standard at this point. The point is though that since this is the only feature in that notch, there's no Face ID tech or anything like that currently, then there didn't really need to be such a large protrusion. My best guess is that they're sort of getting us used to this design because next year's models will have Face ID tech, but that's just speculation. Another design choice is the newly refreshed keyboard, which is now fully black as it was, but the background of the keyboard, or at least the chassis where the keyboard is also fully black. This gives it a really clean and pretty nice look in my opinion. Apart from just the looks though, the keys have slightly more travel and they definitely feel more tactile this year, which is nice. And this is of course sort of reverse engineering the days of the butterfly keyboard, which were an absolute failure. Despite the keys themselves looking pretty similar to the 2015 MacBook Pro keys, these do feel slightly better, and this is one of the best keyboards you're going to get on a laptop, period. Now the trackpad is similar to what you've seen before on MacBook Pros, very large compared to most other laptops out there, which is very nice, and it's extremely responsive. You can do all of the Apple gestures on it, which is nice. And you can click at any point on the trackpad, which is another bonus of a Mac. Furthermore, on the top right hand corner of the keyboard where the power button is, it also doubles as a Touch ID sensor, which is a nice feature. The laptops themselves, both the 14-inch and 16-inch MacBook Pros, are fairly thick compared to previous Macs, and are also fairly hefty as well. Of course the 16-inch is going to be more hefty than the 14-inch. It's definitely not too much though, they're still portable, and what you're getting in return is a pretty huge upgrade to I/O, which we'll get onto now. So basically, if you haven't realized, what's happened over the last few years is that Apple went from having all sorts of I/O on the MacBook Pros, SD card reader, HDMI, headphone jack, and multiple USB ports, to slowly phasing all of that out and leaving you with just USB-C ports or Thunderbolt ports and not much more apart from a headphone jack. Now what they've done is reversed all of that and pretty much gone back to what we had in the 2015 MacBook Pros, which was what you really needed as a creator or pro user. First up, you're getting 3 Thunderbolt 4 ports on either laptop. And if you have the base chipset, the M1 Pro, that means you'll be able to run 2 Pro Display XDRs and 1 4K TV at once. But if you have the upgraded M1 Max chipset, you'll be able to run 3 Pro Display XDRs at once. And the Pro Display XDRs are 6K resolution. In addition to this, as I said before, you now get the HDMI port back, which is absolutely great news, along with the SD card reader, which is really nice for content creators And the headphone jack is still here, but this time it can run high impedance headphones as well, which is great if you want to be able to plug in your studio headphones or something like that, which is a feature which I guess lots of content creators do want to use. Now, one thing which is really nice is that they brought back MagSafe. I don't know if you remember the 2015 MacBook Pros had MagSafe. My MacBook has MagSafe. And it basically means that if somebody trips up on your cable, the cable will just detach because it's magnetic and your laptop won't fly off the table. It's a great feature to have, and I'm glad they brought it back. Now, if you're wondering whether you can still charge with USB-C, yes, you can. You can plug it into one of the Thunderbolt ports and charge your laptop up that way. So you don't necessarily need to carry a different cable for various tasks. If you don't want to carry that MagSafe charger as well, you can just use USB-C. Granted, it will be slightly slower though. Moving on, the speaker system is obviously great. I don't know if you know, but MacBook Pros are well known for having really good speaker systems, which I can vouch for personally. In this laptop, you're getting 6 speakers, including 4 woofers and 2 tweeters, so it should sound great and produce a sort of 3D audio effect as well. In addition to this, if you're planning on using the laptop for Zoom calls a lot or online meetings, then you'll be happy to know that you get free studio quality mics. This is what Apple calls them. I'm not sure if they're quite studio quality, but they're definitely really good for a laptop. And paired with that 1080p camera, you should be fine to run any online meetings. Now let's talk about the thing which is most impressive on this laptop by far, and that is the upgrade to the M1 chipset. So if you don't know, the M1 chipset is an in-house chipset that Apple makes, which is a fairly new concept for them in terms of laptops. And what it means is that since it's their own silicone, they can optimize it to work with the software perfectly or as efficiently as possible, which is good for the user in terms of both battery life and performance. And the performance and battery life are pretty great on these laptops. What's different in these new Macs is that there are now 2 new variants of the M1 chipset to choose between, which are the M1 Pro or the M1 Max. And between these two, the main difference is the number of GPU cores you're getting. So with the M1 Pro chipset, which is the base chipset of the two, the specs are maxed out at 10 CPU cores paired with 16 GPU cores and 32 gigabytes of unified memory. So the unified memory is pretty cool because it means that both the CPU and GPU cores share the same data storage or memory bank, so they can interact a lot faster. They don't have to switch between 2 separate memory or data banks. Along with this, you get 200 gigabytes per second of memory bandwidth, which is very good. Now, if you opt for the M1 Max chipset, on the other hand, you still get 10 CPU cores as the maximum, but you can get up to 32 GPU cores and up to 64 gigabytes of unified memory, which is quite a lot more. Also, the memory bandwidth is double at 400 gigabytes per second. Now, whether you need all of those extra GPU cores and all of that extra unified memory will depend on how intense you're planning to use this laptop. You know, if you're going to be running like 100 applications at the same time, you might need more of that unified memory. But if you're just planning on running 2 or 3 applications, or depending on how intense those applications are, you might not need that extra unified memory. Also, those extra GPU cores will be very important to you if you're planning on using these laptops for very graphics intense things like rendering really large scenes, for example. If you're not planning on going crazy with this laptop, or you have a very specific use case that's very GPU intensive or very memory intensive, then the M1 Pro is probably going to be just fine for you, especially if you're just a student or something who doesn't really need that much performance. But if you are planning on using this laptop for something very specific, like really high detailed renders and things like that, then maybe the M1 Max is something to consider, and it will also future-proof the laptop slightly more. As I said before, the performance that comes out of these chips is absolutely amazing for a laptop. We won't get into the specifics over here, but it definitely compares to some top dogs out there in terms of graphics cards or CPUs. And that, as I said, is mainly because of the efficiency that comes from having an in-house chipset with your in-house software. Of course, it's definitely worth mentioning that although most apps will run pretty well on this chipset, it's the Apple-made apps that will run best. So for example, if you're going to be video editing, you should consider using Final Cut Pro, which is made by Apple, as this will work really efficiently with these chips. But if you want to run like Premiere Pro or something like that, it will still run well, but definitely not as well as running Final Cut Pro. Now onto the displays, which are another very impressive feature of both the 14-inch and 16-inch laptops. No matter which model you get, all of them will come with a 120Hz display, which I didn't think was going to happen on a MacBook for quite some time, and is a very welcome upgrade. This will be great if you want to play some games on this laptop, for example, or you want to do anything that requires a high refresh rate. And anyway, just for day-to-day use, it will seem slightly smoother with that higher refresh rate. You're probably thinking though, this won't be very useful for my day-to-day usage. And you're right, so instead of allowing it to be on 120Hz all the time and draining your battery, it has a variable refresh rate. So say you're just looking at a still image, for example, you don't need the display to refresh 120 times a second. Instead, it will reduce the refresh rate so that you save some battery life in those situations. Also, in terms of brightness, both the 14-inch and 16-inch laptops go up to 1000 nits sustained brightness, or a peak brightness of 1600 nits, which is great. That's plenty bright enough for most use cases. The displays are still glossy though, so I wouldn't work in direct sunlight just because the reflections are annoying, but you definitely could if you had to. The difference between the 14 and 16-inch models, apart from the obvious one, which is size, is that you're also getting a slightly higher resolution panel on the 16-inch model. This isn't something that you're going to notice as a user, I don't think, but it's definitely something to take into account. So on the 14-inch model, you're getting a resolution of 3024 by 1964p, which is very high for a laptop. No, it's not 4K, but you don't really need 4K. That would just excessively drain your battery. It's high enough for whatever you might want to do, and is definitely a nice feature to see. On the 16-inch model, however, you are getting, as I said, a slightly higher resolution of 3456 by 2234 pixels, which is absolutely great for a laptop. As I said before though, although this is slightly higher than the 14-inch model, it's not something that you're realistically going to notice, and both displays are absolutely excellent. Definitely the main thing that should decide whether you get the 14 or 16-inch models is the size of the displays. So if you are going to be designing a lot of things on CAD, for example, then having a large display is definitely helpful. But in terms of portability and just doing day-to-day tasks, the smaller display will be just fine, and slightly more portable as well. The next thing to consider is definitely the battery in the laptops. So in the smaller 14-inch model, you're getting a 70 watt-hour battery, whereas in the larger 16-inch model, you're getting a 100 watt-hour battery. Now, although this does sound quite a lot larger on paper, and yes, there are some improvements that come with this, you have to remember that the 16-inch model also has a larger display, so it will also drain battery more than the 14-inch model. In terms of what Apple quote for battery life, they say that on the 14-inch model, you'll get around 17 hours of video playback, or if you're surfing the web, it will be more like 11 hours. Whereas with the 16-inch model, they quote a higher 21 hours of video playback, so 4 hours more than on the 14-inch model, and 14 hours of surfing the web if you're doing that instead. I would, however, take these numbers with a pinch of salt, because realistically, you probably know that you don't get these numbers in real life, especially since you don't do one task like surfing the internet for 14 hours. You tend to open applications, run certain things at once, and that drains the battery a lot more. Also, the difference between the 14 and 16-inch models probably won't be as much as what they're quoting either. Both will have pretty good battery life because of the efficiency of the chipsets, but you should also take into account that if you are running really intense softwares or like rendering really intense things, for example, the numbers on the battery life will be nowhere near as high as these quoted numbers, because these are just for really light tasks like watching a video or searching Google, for example. Now, you're probably also wondering what charger you get in the box to charge up these batteries. So there are a couple of variants depending on which model of the laptop you get. For the 14-inch laptops, if you get the very base M1 Pro chipset with no upgrades to it, you'll get a 67 watt charger, which is pretty decent and it'll do the job. But if you do get any upgrades to the chipset of the M1 Pro, or say you upgrade to the M1 Max on your order, they'll send you a 96-watt charger, which will charge your laptop up quite a lot faster. Of course, I should say that you can opt to buy the more expensive charger if you're getting the base spec laptop as well. It'll cost you though. With the 16-inch laptop, however, with that larger size and larger price tag comes a much higher wattage charger as well in the box. So no matter which chipset you get within the 16-inch model, they'll send you a 140-watt battery charger, which is absolutely amazing. You'll charge that thing up pretty rapidly with that. And I should also mention that the actual charging brick is quite a lot larger because of this. Definitely worth the trade-off for size though, in terms of fast charging. The last spec is definitely really important for a pro laptop, for a pro user. Less important if you were buying a phone, but definitely on something like this, you want it to be solid, and that is the storage. So you're getting up to 8 terabytes of SSD storage if you absolutely max out either the 14 or 16-inch laptops, but of course the base models will be a lot lower than this. The base models will have 512 gigabytes of storage, which I think if you're going to be keeping the laptop long term is probably not enough unless you have lots of external hard drives. I tend to prefer having around 1 terabyte of storage or more depending on how much you actually want to store on the laptop itself. You kind of want to think, how long are you planning on keeping this laptop for? And if it's more than 4 or 5 years, then I definitely opt for a high storage option so that you don't run into trouble in the future. In terms of the actual SSD speed, which for content creators can be quite important, it goes up to 7.4 gigabytes per second, which I think is perfectly acceptable for a laptop. Finally, the last thing, and likely a very important thing if you're making a decision to buy a laptop like this, is of course the price. For the 14-inch model, if you buy the absolute base spec model, that means 512 gigabytes of storage, only an 8-core CPU, 14-core GPU, and 16 gigabytes of unified memory. That will cost you $1,999 US, which, yes, is a pretty steep starting point, but to be honest, I think that for the performance you're getting in such a small, nice form factor with a software which I think is very nice, it's probably a reasonable price, especially considering that Macs tend to last quite a long time. So if you're going to keep this laptop for 5-6 years or even more, it's definitely worth the price tag. Of course, for students, you probably don't need the performance that you get out of this laptop. So if you're not planning on keeping it for a long time, or you are a student who's on quite a budget, then these might not be the laptops for you. With the 16-inch model, the base spec, very base spec, will cost you $2,499 US, but you do get slightly better base specs for this price, along with that larger display and larger battery as well. So you're getting a 10-core CPU this time as the base, paired with a 16-core GPU, 16 gigabytes of unified memory as well, and also 512 gigabytes of SSD storage, just like the 14-inch model. But those CPU cores and GPU cores will make a slight difference in performance, so that's what you're paying for, again, along with the larger display and battery. Also, don't forget that included in that price is the 140-watt charging brick, which is absolutely insane, whereas with the 14-inch base spec model, you'll get only a 67-watt charger in the box. Now, both of these laptops can be maxed out in terms of spec. The only differences in that case would be the battery and the display. And the max specs are what I quoted earlier in the video in the spec section, but with those will come a much steeper price point. Also, you should consider that the 16-inch laptop will probably do a better job at dissipating heat, so if you are maxing out the specs and you are expecting the fans to turn on and the laptop to be working pretty hard, then maybe you want to consider the 16-inch model, and I'm guessing for your use case you probably like a larger display anyway, so that would suit you better. Overall, I think Apple really nailed it on the head with these laptops. They're absolutely amazing in terms of performance, but also looks. feel, ports, everything. They just did an all-round good job, and they really surprised us this year. It's definitely worth considering though that the benchmarks for the specs are amazing on paper, but they will have to be tested a bit more to make sure that they can hold up in specific use cases like gaming. I'm very confident they do hold up for things like video editing, since even the iPad Pros or the previous gen M1 chipset did a great job for video editing. But for things, again, like gaming, we'll have to see. Other than that, though, I do think the laptop is pretty revolutionary in terms of what it's offering. Yes, the price tag is quite steep, but it's worth it, I think, for what you're getting. If you are planning on picking one of these bad boys up, then I guess the last thing to consider is the color. So these come in two options, either space gray or silver. Definitely though, you should go with space gray because it's cooler. Thanks for watching. I hope the video was informative, and definitely leave some comments below as well. If you did like the video, then leave a thumbs up, and if you want to see more content like this in the future, then definitely hit the subscribe button and notification bell below. Thanks.